Most people who want to lose belly fat already know the basics. Eat less, move more, cut sugar, do some cardio, and yet the belly remains. Not because these people are failing, but because the advice they were given was never quite aimed at the right target. Belly fat, specifically the deep fat stored around the abdominal organs, does not behave the same way as fat stored elsewhere in the body. It has its own biology, its own hormonal sensitivity, and its own set of conditions under which it is released or retained. And until those conditions are understood, most efforts, however sincere, are solving the wrong problem. To understand why belly fat is different, it helps to know what it actually is. The fat visible around the midsection includes two distinct types. Subcutaneous fat sits just beneath the skin. Soft, pinchable, and while cosmetically noticeable, relatively less harmful from a metabolic standpoint. The more significant type is visceral fat, the fat that accumulates deep inside the abdominal cavity, surrounding the liver, pancreas, and intestines. Visceral fat is not passive storage. It is metabolically active tissue that releases inflammatory compounds and fatty acids directly into the portal circulation, which feeds the liver. This is why high levels of visceral fat are associated with a broader range of metabolic disruption than fat stored elsewhere. It is also the harder kind to shift. The reason visceral fat is so resistant to conventional approaches comes down to one hormone more than any other: insulin. Insulin is released by the pancreas in response to rising blood glucose, and its primary job is to move that glucose into cells for energy or storage. But insulin has a second effect that rarely gets mentioned in popular health conversations. It actively suppresses lipolysis, the biological process by which fat cells release stored fat into the bloodstream to be used as fuel. When insulin is elevated, fat breakdown is suppressed. And in a modern eating pattern, where food is consumed across 12 to 15 hours of the day, often including refined carbohydrates, snacks between meals, and sweetened drinks, insulin remains elevated for the majority of waking hours. The body simply never spends enough time in a low insulin state for visceral fat mobilization to occur at a meaningful rate. This is the mechanism that most fat loss advice never addresses. Exercise burns calories during the session, but an hour of cardio does not restructure the hormonal pattern that governs fat storage and release across the remaining 23 hours of the day. If insulin remains chronically elevated because of eating patterns, the biological door to fat release stays largely closed, regardless of how much movement is added on top. This is not to say exercise is unimportant. Resistance training in particular has shown meaningful effects on insulin sensitivity, improving the body's ability to manage glucose with lower insulin output over time, which does contribute to the hormonal conditions that allow visceral fat to be released. But exercise alone, without addressing the insulin environment created by eating patterns, tends to produce results that plateau far earlier than expected. The approaches that research has linked most consistently to visceral fat reduction share a common thread. They all reduce the duration or magnitude of insulin elevation throughout the day. Diets lower in rapidly digested carbohydrates tend to produce smaller glucose spikes and correspondingly lower insulin responses. Reducing meal frequency and compressing the daily window of eating gives insulin more hours each day to fall to its baseline. Improving sleep quality matters here too. Sleep deprivation raises cortisol, which in turn raises glucose and insulin, creating the same fat-storing hormonal conditions through an entirely different pathway. These are not separate strategies competing with each other. They are different entry points into the same underlying system. The real-world consequence of misunderstanding this is the experience so many people describe: months of effort, visible fitness improvements in some areas, and yet the belly fat barely moves. This is not a willpower failure. It is a targeting failure. The effort was real, but the lever being pulled was not the one connected to the mechanism driving the problem. The mental shift required here is moving from thinking about belly fat as a simple calorie storage problem to understanding it as a hormonal regulation problem, one where the conditions for fat release need to be created, not just the conditions for calorie burning. Once this shift happens, the questions change. Instead of asking how to burn more, The more useful question becomes how to spend more hours each day in a metabolic state that permits fat mobilization. That might mean fewer meals rather than smaller ones. It might mean improving sleep before changing exercise. It might mean addressing carbohydrate quality before increasing cardio duration. None of this produces results overnight, and individual variation in insulin sensitivity, genetics, stress, and hormonal health means that the same approach does not work identically for every person. What the science does consistently point toward is that visceral fat responds to hormonal conditions more than to calorie arithmetic alone. Understanding that distinction does not make the process easier, but it does make the process more accurately aimed. And for something as stubborn as belly fat, accuracy matters more than effort.